1. Vevey, Switzerland. Vevey is a beautiful little town on the shore of a very blue lake in Switzerland. Tourism is the business of the place, and there are many hotels. American tourists particularly like the hotel called the Trois Couronnes. 2 years ago, a young American named Frederick Winterbourne spent a few days there. He had come from Geneva to see his aunt, Mrs. Costello, who was staying at the Trois Couronnes. The morning after Winterbourne arrived in Vevey, his aunt had a headache, so he was free to sit in the garden of the hotel and enjoy its beauties. He sat by the wall, looking out at the castle of Chillon, which stood on a small island in the lake. Winterbourne was 27 years old and had lived in Geneva for a long time. He had been at school and university there. When his friends spoke of him, they usually said that he was at Geneva studying. When certain other people spoke of him, they said that he spent so much time in Geneva because he was very attached to a lady who lived there, a European lady, a person older than himself. None of his American friends had ever met this lady. As Winterbourne was drinking his coffee in the garden of the Trois Couronnes, a small boy came up to him and said,
"Can you give me a lump of sugar?"
Winterbourne noticed that the boy spoke with an American accent. He pointed to the bowl of sugar and said,
"Take one, but I don't think sugar is good for little boys."
The boy took 3 lumps of sugar. He put 2 in his pocket and 1 in his mouth.
"I eat sugar lumps,"
he said.
"because I can't get any candy here. American candy is the best."
"And are American boys the best?"
asked Winterbourne.
"I don't know,"
said the child.
"I am an American boy." "Are you an American man?"
"Yes."
"American men are the best,"
said the boy. Then, looking around, he added,
"Here comes my sister."
Winterbourne looked up and saw a beautiful young lady coming towards them.
"American girls are the best,"
he said cheerfully to his companion.
"My sister isn't the best,"
said the boy.
"She's always criticizing me."
"That's probably your fault, not hers,"
said Winterbourne. The young lady was dressed very elegantly in white.
"How pretty they are,"
thought Winterbourne, preparing to get up. The young lady stopped in front of him. She looked out over the blue lake.
"Randolph,"
she said.
"what are you doing?"
"I'm talking to this man,"
said Randolph.
"He's an American."
Winterbourne stood up and said,
"Your brother and I have been discussing America."
He felt a little embarrassed. In Geneva, a gentleman could not speak to a young lady without being formally introduced. The young lady looked at him quickly, then looked back at the lake.
"We've been talking about American candy,"
said the boy.
"I don't want to go to Italy. I want to go home to America."
"Are you going to Italy?"
asked Winterbourne.
"Yes."
replied the young lady.
"Italy is a beautiful place."
"But can you get any candy there?"
asked Randolph.
"I think you've had enough candy."
said his sister.
"And Mother thinks so too."
"Isn't this a splendid lake?"
said Winterbourne. He no longer felt embarrassed, because he realized that the young lady did not feel embarrassed. When she looked at him, her eyes were honest and fresh. They were very pretty eyes. In fact, she was the prettiest girl he had seen for a long time. Her face was delicate, but perhaps a little vulgar. It was bright, sweet, and superficial. He thought that she might be a flirt, but her expression was too innocent. Before long, she was speaking to him freely. She told him that she was going to Rome for the winter with her mother and Randolph. She told him that she was from New York State.
"Her name's Daisy Miller,"
said Randolph.
"but that isn't her real name. Her real name is Annie P. Miller. And my father's name is Ezra B. Miller. He's back in New York State. He's got a big business. My father's rich.
Miss Miller sat down and talked to Winterbourne, while Randolph ran round the garden. She talked a lot about her family, about her travels in Europe, about the hotels and the trains. Sometimes she looked at Winterbourne, and sometimes she looked out at the lake.
The hotels are very good.
Said Miss Daisy Miller.
And I think Europe is perfectly sweet. I'm not disappointed, not at all. I knew a lot about Europe before I came here. I have lots of friends at home who've traveled in Europe, and they told me all about it. And back home I have lots of dresses from Paris.
Winterbourne enjoyed this conversation. It was many years since he had heard a young girl talk so much.
The only thing I don't like about Europe is the society,
said Miss Miller.
I like society. Last winter 17 dinners were given in my honor, 3 of them by gentlemen.
She looked at him with her slightly monotonous smile and said,
I've always had a lot of gentlemen friends.
Winterbourne was amused, perplexed, and charmed. He felt that he had lived too long in Geneva and therefore could no longer understand young American girls. He had never met a girl like this before. Was she simply a pretty girl from New York? Were they all like that? Or was she an immoral young woman? She looked extremely innocent. Winterbourne decided that she was just a pretty American flirt. He was happy to have found a formula to describe Miss Daisy Miller.
Have you been to that old castle?
Asked Miss Miller, pointing to the castle of Chillon.
Yes.
I want to go there, but Randolph doesn't want to go.
You could ask someone to stay with Randolph at the hotel.
Will you stay with him?
Can't I come to the castle of Chillon with you?
Asked Winterbourne. He was afraid that he had offended her, but she did not blush.
And your mother, of course,
He said very respectfully.
Oh, Mother won't come.
Said Miss Daisy Miller.
She'll stay with Randolph, and Eugenio will stay too. He's our courier, so we can go to the castle.
Winterbourne thought,
We can only mean Miss Miller and I. It's too good to be true.
At that moment, Eugenio came up to them. He looked at Winterbourne with suspicion, then said,
Lunch is ready, mademoiselle.
Oh, Eugenio,
Daisy Miller replied.
I'm going to that old castle anyway.
Really?
Said Eugenio. He looked at Winterbourne disrespectfully. Miss Miller blushed a little.
We are going, aren't we?
She asked Winterbourne.
I won't be happy until we go.
He said.
And you are staying at this hotel?
She continued.
And you really are an American?
I'll introduce you to my aunt, Mrs. Costello. She can tell you all about me.
Oh, well,
Said Daisy Miller.
we'll go someday.
She smiled at Winterbourne and walked back to the hotel with Eugenio. Chapter 2. Mrs. Costello. The next day, Winterbourne went to see his aunt in her room.
I hope you're feeling better.
He said.
A little.
Replied Mrs. Costello. She was a rich widow and an important figure of New York society. She had a long, pale face and a lot of white hair. She had 2 married sons in New York and a third son who was traveling in Europe but had not come to see her. Winterbourne had come to Vevey just to see his aunt. She often told him that he paid more attention to her than her own sons did.
Have you noticed an American family here at the hotel?
Asked Winterbourne.
A family called Miller?
A mother, a daughter, a little boy, and a courier. Oh, yes, I've noticed them.
Said Mrs. Costello.
I confess I'm very exclusive, but in New York you have to be. There are so many vulgar people in society these days. That Miller family is a perfect example.
The young girl is very pretty.
Said Winterbourne.
Of course she's pretty, but she's very vulgar. She's too friendly with the courier. Her mother is just as bad. They treat the courier like a family friend. He probably eats dinner with them. I'm sure they've never seen a man with such good manners, such fine clothes, so like a gentleman. He sits with them in the garden and smokes cigars.
I see what you mean, of course.
said the young man.
But I met the young lady in the garden. I'd like to introduce her to you.
I'm afraid I can't meet her. Why do you want to introduce her to me?
To guarantee my respectability.
But who'll guarantee hers?
Oh, you're cruel,
said the young man.
She's a very nice girl and completely unsophisticated. I'm going to take her to the castle of Chillon.
Really? And how long had you known her when this plan was formed?
asked Mrs. Costello in surprise.
Half an hour,
said Winterbourne, smiling.
Oh, what a terrible girl!
cried Mrs. Costello.
My dear Frederick, you've been away from America too long. You're too innocent. You'll make some great mistake.
I'm not so innocent.
You're too guilty, then.
Winterbourne sat in silence for a while, then said,
So I can't introduce her to you?
No, I can't accept a girl who talks to strangers in hotels.
But don't all the young girls in America do that sort of thing?
My granddaughters don't do that sort of thing,
said Mrs. Costello. Winterbourne had heard his pretty cousins in New York described as terrible flirts. If Miss Daisy Miller did things that his cousins did not do, she must be very unconventional indeed. Winterbourne was impatient to see her again. That evening, he met Miss Daisy Miller walking in the garden. She seemed very pleased to see him.
Have you been walking here all alone?
He asked.
No,
She replied.
I've been walking with Mother, but she's gone to find Randolph. She wants him to go to bed. He doesn't like to go to bed before 11.
Winterbourne and Daisy walked in the garden together,
I hear that your aunt is very exclusive.
said Daisy.
I want to meet her. I know I'll like her.
Winterbourne was embarrassed.
I'm afraid she often has headaches,
he said. Daisy looked at him for a moment, then said,
She doesn't want to meet me. Why don't you just say so? You needn't be afraid. I'm not afraid.
She gave a little nervous laugh. Winterbourne wanted to comfort her. He wanted to tell her that his aunt was a snob and that her opinion was not important. But just then a lady came into the garden and stood at a distance from them, looking out at the lake.
Oh, there's Mother,
said Daisy Miller. Mrs. Miller was a small, nervous-looking person, very elegantly dressed, with enormous diamonds in her ears.
I should go,
said Winterbourne.
No,
Replied Daisy.
I want to introduce you to Mother. I always introduce my gentleman friends to Mother.
She doesn't seem to want to be introduced to me,
said Winterbourne, since Mrs. Miller still had not looked at him.
She's very shy.
Daisy explained. Then she took Winterbourne over to meet her mother.
Mother, this is Mr. Winterbourne,
said Daisy very prettily. Yes, Miss Daisy Miller was vulgar, as Mrs. Costello had said, but Winterbourne thought she also had an unusual and delicate grace.
Did you convince Randolph to go to bed?
asked Daisy.
No,
Replied Mrs. Miller,
he won't go.
He won't do what he's told.
said Daisy.
He won't go to that castle either. So I'm going with Mr. Winterbourne.
It's a beautiful castle, Mrs. Miller.
Said Winterbourne.
Don't you want to see it?
No, thank you.
Said Mrs. Miller.
Daisy will go, though.
Winterbourne thought how very different Mrs. Miller was from the vigilant mothers of Geneva. They never let their daughters go anywhere unprotected.
Mr. Winterbourne,
Said Daisy suddenly.
will you take me out on a boat?
Now?
Yes, now.
Well, Annie Miller.
Cried her mother.
I'm sure that Mr. Winterbourne wants to take me out on a boat.
Said Daisy, laughing.
But what time is it? I'm sure it's time to go to bed.
Said Mrs. Miller.
It's 11 o'clock, madam.
Said a voice from the darkness.
Oh, Genio,
Said Daisy.
I'm going out on a boat.
At 11 o'clock, mademoiselle?
Please tell her she can't go.
Said Mrs. Miller to the courier.
Does Mademoiselle want to go alone?
asked Eugenio.
No,
Mrs. Miller replied.
she wants to go with this gentleman.
Eugenio looked at Winterbourne, then he said,
As Mademoiselle pleases.
Why don't you say no?
said Daisy to the courier.
I don't want to go now.
She turned to Winterbourne, smiled, and said,
Good night. I hope you're disgusted or disappointed or something.
I'm confused.
said Winterbourne. He stood and watched the two ladies and their courier as they walked back into the hotel.